I'm at the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities here at the UVA School of Medicine, and I'm Marcia Day Childress. I'm with the center. Our program today is called The Shape of the Eye, Stories About Down Syndrome. 10 years ago, when George Estreich was born, her appearance posed a puzzle. Did the shape of her eyes indicate Down syndrome? Or did they simply reflect the fact that she has a Japanese grandmother? In a powerful memoir titled The Shape of the Eye, Down Syndrome, Family, and the Stories We Inherit, which was published earlier this year, George Estreich, a writer and stay-at-home dad, tells his daughter's story, reflecting on all aspects of Laura's inheritance, from the literal material legacy of her genes, to the family history that precedes her, to the Victorian physician John Langdon Down, and his diagnostic error and misnomer of Mongolian idiocy. The description of Down syndrome that we know from genetics lectures and medical textbooks, a list of probabilities attached to a representative figure, is at odds with the typical parent's description, which situates a single child and the diagnosis in time and place. The gap between these two ways of understanding Down syndrome challenges families and health professionals alike. But acknowledging this gap's presence and seeking to bridge it offers hope for better communication and better outcomes for all involved. It's partly a matter of becoming more thoughtful about the language we use and its baggage, and partly a matter of appreciating how medical advances, early educational and behavioral interventions, and social awareness have changed dramatically the prospects for children with Down syndrome and their families. In this Medical Center Hour, in a presentation that counterbalances the conventional clinical tale of Down syndrome, George Estreich joins us from Corvallis, Oregon, to offer stories from his memoir. He'll provide a parent's perspective and explore some of how we as a society think and talk about this condition. This is something of a homecoming for George, I'm happy to say. He's a 1986 graduate of the University of Virginia. He also met his wife while they were both students here. And it's wonderful to have George back, and I've been telling him we ordered just the right weather for someone from Oregon to return to UVA. We've also invited pediatrician Ann Kellams, who's an assistant professor of clinical pediatrics and medical director of the newborn nursery, to comment briefly following George's presentation. Ann's work with babies and their families and her teaching of the healer's art, which is a course for medical students about meaning and medicine, take her right to the heart of what George's story is about. It's our hope that this hour will prompt us all to think anew about Down syndrome and the persons and the families it affects, and more broadly, help us to examine our social constructions of and responses to disability. Now, the UVA bookstore was intending to have George Estreich's book here for sale and signing, but there was a glitch in the order, and the books did not get here. Instead, the bookstore, Patsy Goolsby is here from the bookstore outside the upper door. She will take orders, and if you order the book through her, it will be delivered to your office when it comes in. Otherwise, the book is available on Amazon.com, and I would highly recommend it to you. It's a wonderful read, and as you'll hear from what George has to say. Welcome, George.
Can you hear me all right? Yes? Okay. Marcia, thank you so much for inviting me. This is the best possible way to return to the university. I think it's been about 10 years since I've been here. And I'm particularly glad to have the opportunity to speak with doctors and medical professionals, just because based on the conversations that we had around Laura when Laura was very sick, where she's well now, I realized how many issues are in medicine are communication issues, and I think that this kind of forum can be a good start towards thinking about what those are. The presentation subtitle is Stories About Down Syndrome, and just What I'm going to do today is read a few short sections from the book, just to give you a representative sense of what the book is about, as well as to raise some issues. And I want to define stories as broadly as possible, not just stories about Laura's life in our family, but also stories about making sense of the diagnosis as a parent, and also talking about what Marcia referred to, what's sometimes called the medical model of Down syndrome, the way Down syndrome is conventionally described. Okay. I'm going to bring, excuse me, I'm going to begin with the introduction, which describes us learning Laura's diagnosis. Now, most of you will know that almost all babies with Down syndrome, if they're not diagnosed prenatally, are diagnosed at birth. They're hypotonic, their muscles are floppy, their appearance is distinctive, and so on. Because Laura was missing, because her muscles weren't as good, because she was missing typical features, and because my mother is Japanese, no one knew, or we hoped we didn't know. But we had to wait 2 weeks for the karyotype to come back. This scene is a brief scene that describes us getting the diagnosis, and I think it frames what I want to do today. Introduction. We were waiting for our family doctor. I felt not serene, but expectant, uncertain. Teresa lifted Laura from her car seat and set her, still sleeping, on the clean white paper at the exam table. I got out colored pencils and a notebook for Ellie. We were paging through magazines when Dr. E came in, knocking softly. He closed the door, crossed the room, and turned towards us. "We got the lab test back," he said. "Nancy called and had them faxed down here." He paused. "Laura does have Down syndrome," he said. Ellie was coloring quietly. From where I was standing, I could see the first tears forming in Teresa's eyes. "I believe," he said, "that these children come to the families most able to take care of them." No one said anything. Ellie kept drawing her rainbow, keeping the colored lines parallel. There was a bump in the first line she'd drawn, and she copied it through all the succeeding lines, the blip softening into a gentle swell. Ellie, meticulous, precise, absorbed. She didn't seem to register the news. Teresa stared up at the doctor, her eyes wet. I felt nothing, only the grip of fact, so I began asking questions, setting them out like planks heaved across quicksand. What do we do? Whom do we contact? What do we need to know? I thought a lot about that moment in the weeks following, the way Dr. E turned towards us, the door easing towards an institutional click. His face, pinker than usual, the hush in his voice, his gentleness. All said that the news was coming. Laura did have Down syndrome. The question attending her birth had been answered, but that answer only seemed another question. Or it was, like the chromosome itself, the beginning of 1,000 questions. Clearly an answer was called for. And this book, of course, is that answer. And as you'll see in the sections I read today, it also comments on the process of answering, on the process of building a story about Down syndrome. I began to read. I wanted to understand what Laura had. Down syndrome, as I learned, is a chromosomal disorder. Chromosomes are long strings of DNA, the molecule that encodes inheritance. Taken together, they constitute a genome, a full set of instructions for guiding development from the fertilized egg. Most people have 46 chromosomes, 23 from mom, 23 from dad, a perfectly matched set. People with the main form of Down syndrome have an extra copy of the 21st chromosome, the smallest. Because that extra copy is present at conception, it is preserved faithfully through each successive cell division, and 10 trillion or so cells or so later, it is ubiquitous in the body. I know this is a review for a lot of you. Having an extra chromosome makes for significant changes. People with Down syndrome have a distinctive look, almost always with almond-shaped eyes. They have some degree of intellectual disability, usually in the mild to moderate range, and they're at increased risk for a number of medical problems, including heart defects, intestinal malformations, and leukemia, though an individual child may have none of these. There are also features you wouldn't notice if you weren't looking for them, like a single line across the palm. Writing this description, I know it is necessary and misleading, accurate and deeply false. A syndrome means at root a running together. When you have a child, it all runs together. The heart defect, the eyes, the way her voice sounds, the name of the speech therapist, the worries over the future, the joys of discovery, the sliding sense, slow, quiet, enormous, an avalanche in the skull. The different is not as different as you thought. The genes produce a child who lives a story, whose story is bound up with yours. So reducing a child to a heap of medical fragments is, for a parent, a complicated and dissonant act. It is a necessary fiction, a story one tells only in order to move on. Nobody, so far as I know, finds out that a newborn child has Down syndrome, shrugs, and returns to decorating the nursery. We were undone by the news for a long time. If Down syndrome were ordinary in the world, if a common sense view of dignity and personhood and capability prevailed, then perhaps our early days would have been easier. But Down syndrome is not ordinary in the world. I kept looking things up, against whispers in my own brain, against shocked silence, against the raw unfamiliarity of our newest family member. I turned to fact. I felt not just ignorant, but culpably ignorant. And yet in my reading, I only found my own confusion writ large. I felt that Laura's life was valuable, that she was a child, a sister and daughter and granddaughter above all, that she might learn and thrive. I also felt that our lives were over, that her birth was a tragedy, and that we were condemned to a half-life of hospitals, acronyms, therapists, and forms. In my unhinged research, I discovered that everything was true. She was, quote, a child first, but of course she could have this problem and this one and this one and this one. Or the big list came first, typically framed as they. They have heart defects, intestinal atresias, low IQs, joint problems, and on and on. Oh, but they're happy little tykes. None of it made sense. I did not see how a child could be happy if she had so many problems. I did not see how, with so many problems, she could be a child first. I had sought refuge in fact, like someone who ducks into a cathedral for quiet and instead finds an echo chamber for every footfall. Or I was the echo chamber, thronged with a dense collision of numbers and hope and resignation. There were, it seemed, two kinds of stories told about my daughter. In one, she seemed to be a developing child. In the other, she seemed not even human. She was a defect, a tragedy, an abnormality. I did not see how she could be both. It was as if Teresa had given birth to a blur. So, Marcia alluded to this in her opening, which is this idea that we have these two incompatible ideas of what Down syndrome is. And at the end of this talk, I want to talk a little bit about how I reconcile them in my own mind. But I wanted to give what I thought was an honest and direct account of what it felt to be caught in between the medical knowledge we needed and this idea of her being a child and future citizen. And that's a big cognitive gap for most parents, I venture to say. So I'll talk a little bit about that some more. This book is, I try to give the sense of what it felt like to be at year zero. In other words, if you have, I think people will probably agree that not just Down syndrome, but any sudden calamity or huge change really feels like it resets the clock, like it's year one. And the very strong feeling I had was that we were just starting over. I didn't know what applied from raising our, quote, normal child. I didn't know what the first part of our lives had to do with the next part, or what the next part would be like. And this book is about reassembling that story. And for that reason, the book has it moves forward in time through Laura's life, but it keeps looping back into the past. And so the section I'm going to read now is one of those loops, and it starts here. This is about me and my wife. We met in 1983, near the end of our first year at the University of Virginia, in the Pleistocene era of what was not even a relationship, but is now a marriage, when my hair was still long and I still drank herbal tea. We were 18 years old. We sat on the floor of Teresa's dorm room, talking, then silent. I didn't mind the silences, they felt fine. Besides, I was nursing a low-grade depression that I hoped was mysteriously attractive. Teresa furrowed her brow, pinwheeled a pencil through her fingers, looked unsure of what to say. I liked her right away, liked her. But with one thing and other entanglements, the usual fears, the poet unable to communicate his feelings, we were just friends for a long time. It's safe to say that neither of us was thinking about Down syndrome then, but it may be that Laura's story had already begun, that the non-disjunction had already occurred, and the extra 21st chromosome was already present, ready to shape a face, a heart, a child trailed by murmurs. If our lives were a tragedy, we would call this fate, the thread of inheritance spun out of the dark of family, the ancient fault surfacing in a new ruin. But our lives are not tragic, only puzzling most of the time. It's all dead-end metaphysics anyway, irrelevant to daily life. Whether the extra chromosome was waiting for years to shape our lives, or whether it arrived later, like a mysterious guest stepping off a train, is simply unknowable. And if we could know it, that certainty would not console. All of our chromosomes reach backwards into the past, into a darkness we cannot see. So to tell a story about family and chromosomes is to choose a beginning for a story that has no beginning, and an end where there is no end. Teresa had grown up the oldest of 5 in a Catholic family, first in Irwin, a small town outside Pittsburgh, and then as her father ascended the ranks of the phone company in the suburbs of Philadelphia. I had grown up outside New York. My father was deeply Jewish and deeply non-observant. My mother was technically Jewish, a wedding convert, but had grown up in Japan, arriving in America at the age of 30. Raised in the cradle of devotion, Teresa had become a chemistry major. She already had the best qualities of the scientist she would become: pragmatic, thoughtful, observant in the secular sense. She liked organic chemistry. She was interested, she said, in the fact that tiny quantities of neurotransmitters made it possible for you to remember your name and what happened yesterday. Over 20 years ago, and who knows what I said in response? Probably I sipped my tea, nodded vigorously, and did my best to continue appearing sensitive, since that was clearly working. Having been brought up myself by pragmatic relativists, wanderers, loners, skeptics, I was trying to write poetry, the religion of the irreligious, and had developed an enthusiastic taste for absolutes. But every difference between us was part of a continental attraction. In late-night conversations interrupted by alcoholic braying from the dorm balcony, I made sweeping statements on topics I knew nothing about, after which Teresa would calmly ask a question I had not thought of, or point out a fact I had not known. I kept talking to keep her from going away. I'd found someone I should not let go of. This perception has endured beneath my boring turmoil. We dated through college. In graduate school, in the days before cell phones and email, we racked up 3 years of $80 phone bills, saw each other on alternate weekends, memorized the highways between Ithaca and Philadelphia. I finished my master's in poetry writing, taught English for another year, then moved to Philadelphia. A year later, in 1990, we were married in her parents' suburban church with over 200 guests, most of them from Teresa's side. We had added to the standard vows a promise to honor each other's spiritual growth. The words were vague enough to be permitted, but different enough to startle the parish priest, who had been drowsing in a chair on the dais. The reception was a spectacular success, although the caterer had a panic attack and locked herself behind her office door. I played guitar badly with the band. Teresa threw the bouquet and garter, and children fought over them. By then, my mother and father, who had looked uneasy and outnumbered on the hard pews, had begun to enjoy themselves. The next day, in a synagogue I had visited only once, we were blessed by a rabbi before a sparse assembly of immediate family. We rented an apartment in Philadelphia so Teresa could finish her degree. I taught freshman composition at 3 different colleges. 2 years later, after months of fading hope, Teresa's father died of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. A year later, Teresa finished her degree and we moved to North Carolina. Teresa had a postdoctoral fellowship at UNC Chapel Hill, and I got a job teaching comp at Duke. It was 1993. We bought our first house, a 4-square on 2 acres with a failing well. We got Penny, an eccentric and submissive cinnamon-colored mutt, and began to think about having a child. A year and a half later, Teresa discovered on her first trip to the fertility clinic that she was already pregnant. "We do good work here," said the nurse, smiling. 2 weeks later, my father called to say he had a spot on his lung. I immediately began renovating the house. Ellie was born that October, a pure happiness ringed by sawdust, end-stage cancer, and ungraded papers. My father died 4 months later. Soon afterwards, I quit teaching to raise Ellie full-time at home and to write poetry when I could. In 1998, when Ellie was 2.5, Teresa was offered a tenure-track job in Oregon. After our years living on the margins of academia, mobile, rootless, hyper-educated, underpaid, we might at last settle down. Another dream of permanence, beginning with another departure. We visited in February, and as Teresa negotiated the equipment budget in her startup package, I took Ellie to an elementary school playground. Twilight, cool out but not cold, everything wet, a sliver of sunlight weighed down by clouds. I wiped off the dripping slide with my jacket. The trees across the playground were shrouded in pale green. That evening, I asked one of Teresa's future colleagues, Wasn't it early for spring leaves? No, I was told. That was moss from all the rain. So we bought a house in Corvallis, Oregon, where the ocean was on the left, the jays looked wrong, and it hardly ever snowed. We arrived in September and began settling in. We went to the farmer's market. We found the bagel place, the coffee place. In the evenings, we went to Chip Ross Park, where you could climb a small rise and look south down the valley, a flat swath of grass and interstate. You could see glints of the Willamette River in its wide meander north towards the Columbia. To the east were new mountains, abraded cones edging snowy tops above green foothills. Beyond them were all the rivers I wanted to learn. To the west were the older hills of the Coast Range, rounded and blurred together like the waves of the Pacific beyond. We liked the town. It seemed tidy without being sterile, free of the southern social codes that had puzzled us in North Carolina. In Oregon, everyone seemed to be from somewhere else too, so we fit right in. We made friends easily. Teresa began teaching, setting up her lab, writing grants. Tenure was not a given, but her chances, given reasonable progress, seemed good. We enrolled Ellie, then 3, in a preschool. While she was there, I wrote and worked on the house. It was not long before we began, cautiously, to think of a second child. Ellie had been so wonderful, such a gift beyond imagining, that it seemed unfair to deny her a sibling. Until Laura was born, or more precisely until her diagnosis, we could still understand ourselves as having one kind of typical American story. We had grown up in the suburbs and gone to college. We had graduate theses bound in black, stamped in gold, and printed on archival paper to endure for non-existent readers. We had experienced the death of parents, the birth of a child. We did not attend church or synagogue. We leaned to the left politically, but beyond voting did little. Now that story seemed over, and we seemed part of another one, where you spent your life in hospitals, you had to sue your local township so your kid could play soccer, and you got airlifted in a life flight helicopter once in a while to a major medical center. We did not feel ready. We had, as one friend emailed us, taken an exit ramp to another planet. We had not only lost our own story, but the possibility of any story. A story in its very structure offers comfort. Even the bleakest story has a curve of action, a beginning, middle, and end. And so it offers the possibility that experience can have an intelligible shape. But having a child with Down syndrome did not map onto a rising or falling curve of action. The event derided every curve. It spoke of chance, not continuity. In the original meiotic error by which the extra chromosome came to occupy an egg or sperm, and now in the array of dire probabilities the pamphlets disclosed. So we felt clueless, benighted, deceived. For months it had been true. We had not even known what our story was. One reason I wanted to read this, as I say, is particularly if you are in the situation of disclosing a diagnosis, this is what parents are trying to think about. I had this life before, I have this life now. How is it all going to line up? And it does happen for most, but it takes some time. Okay, I want to I want to read one more, or two very brief sections from Laura's first year. Her first year was difficult. She was born with a complete AV canal defect. She also had, and that was repaired when she was about 15 weeks old. But even before that, she'd had a non-RSV thing at 9 weeks, which was complicated by the unrepaired heart. So she'd had one emergency hospitalization. And as a consequence of that, she stopped eating by mouth. I'll be happy to talk to you about NG tube experiences, but I won't start that right now. So the first year was quite difficult. And I want to give a snapshot into that, but that's not the whole story. And I guess the better, the book's cover, this picture of Laura at 7, is a much better sense of how things are now. And I look into that as well. Okay. This is a description of Laura just after her open heart surgery.
Is your lovely doctor?
Thank you. Can you still hear all right? It's good? Okay, good. I'm getting thumbs up in the back, so it must be all right. Okay. The nurse said Laura was settled in and we could come on back. We followed past rooms darkened for sleep. children unconscious beneath digitized vitals, and extended families red-eyed, talking in small groups or staring up at monitors. The ICU is laid out roughly as a large square with a central nurses' station ringed by individual rooms. Each room was partitioned from the hallway by sliding glass doors. Laura was in room 10. She seemed tiny in the bed. The incision stretched from just below her throat to just above her belly. I've blocked out or forgotten exactly what it looked like, having accustomed myself to the pale, straggly line of her scar. I remember that her eyes were half parted, filled with a kind of grease to keep them moist. She'd been given a paralytic to keep her from pulling out her tubes and could not blink. Her lips were taped shut around a thin, clear hose. I didn't connect it at first with a ventilator, the squat machine that inflated and deflated her lungs for her, its screen drawing and redrawing a graphic of each breath. There was a catheter which drained through a clear tube to a lucite box, graduated in milliliter increments. Arterial and venous lines looked magnified and apart under clear tape. Pacemaker wires sprouted from her chest. Once I looked down and saw blood around one of the wires. It was weeping, the nurse said, and I felt shocked as if I'd been solving a crossword puzzle and the paper had bled. Above the bed on an articulated arm was a flat screen monitor. It displayed her vitals, heart rate, systolic and diastolic, blood pressure, right atrial pressure, left atrial pressure, pulmonary artery pressure, temperature, O2 saturations. Each number was a different color. The numbers changed moment to moment. Each readout had a set threshold. If her oxygen saturations or SATs dropped below 92 or heart rate went above 180, an alarm would go off. A soft department store chime echoed distantly at the nurse's station. We heard the chimes often. Usually it was nothing, but the chime continued, the conversations would end. If the chime continued, the conversations would end. We'd watch together, Teresa, the nurse, and I, and if nothing improved, the doctor would come in. We were already used to it, the way a ventilator's ascending trill or a flashing red number could haul you up out of waiting. Sometimes I would leave the ICU for coffee and return to see a knot of specialists at the foot of Laura's bed. From the back, I could see them watching the monitor. I'd come in and ask what happened, and Teresa would say, her blood pressure crashed again, or her SATs dropped again. Laura would stabilize, and the crowd would thin. This, too, I got used to. Across the bed from the monitor were the infusion pumps for glucose solution, heart drugs, pain medications, sedatives. Each pump clutched a syringe. Each syringe fed a clear tube that snaked across the bed through a system of color-coded ports. The ports connected to Laura. Each tube had a flag of sticky tape on it that said Wednesday. As the days went on and the tubes were changed out, they accumulated new flags until there was a confusion of days beside Laura's bed, a scrambled calendar, Friday, Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, a week without a year. When I remember it now, I remember it as a single time, our time in the ICU. I collapse it, I confuse sequence, I travel by association across the days. But time was crushingly linear. We were waiting for things that had not happened yet. Laura had not yet come off the vent. She had not yet urinated in significant quantities. Her heart rate had not come down. Her blood pressure kept crashing inexplicably. All of this imprisoned us in the present, kept us from an impossibly distant future when our child would breathe on her own. Though we knew she would, at the time it seemed unlikely. Her breathing without machines seemed part of our other life, the one visible through the picture windows that lined the hospital hallways. Out there, down the hill, was Portland, its traffic slowing at rush hour. Everyone down there driving and breathing. In our bleakest moments, this stasis, this frozen waiting, seemed to distill the experience of raising Laura. The milestones stretching in an endless series, dominoes too heavy to fall. When will she breathe? When will she eat by mouth? When will she hold her head up? When will she crawl? When will she speak, hear, understand us? Every when seemed shadowed by an unspoken if. We had moved to the laid-back Northwest, where being in the moment is prized as a good thing, as something children remember, and we have forgotten. But we were in the moment, and we didn't want to be there. So it's funny, I've been doing a number of readings, and I'll read things and remember revisions, tiny revisions I made for whatever reason. And one revision that was just really 2 words inserted into that paragraph, but signify shift in perspective, was the word seemed. When I first wrote that, it was not that long after we'd been through this, and I really did believe that this was going to be life with Down syndrome. It's just like, that endless waiting for the next milestone, this ends. And now here's Laura, she's adding numbers, she is reading. You know, she's reading simpler books to be sure than her fellow fifth graders, but she's in a regular fifth grade class. She has no problem communicating. And we have learned that a constricted vocabulary can be compensated for with persistence, particularly in requesting TV. But you know, so she is, you know, those what I believed was wrong. And so, you know, doing the final rewrite on this book, there were little changes there, little verb tense changes, little pronoun changes that really meant a whole lot in terms of shifted perspective. I want to leap ahead now because I know we're till about 10 after, you think? About that? Okay. I want to leap ahead to something more recent. And this is a description of Laura at her preschool. And even this is quite some time ago. She's now in 5th grade. She'll be going to middle school next year, which brings not a little bit of fear for us. But then we were terrified of kindergarten, and it worked out okay. So you know, we know now at least to suspect our anxieties. But this is one of the. There are several sections through the book or throughout the book, I thread these sections that are more journal-like. They're just set in the present tense to give that sense of what it's like. And this is March 2005. It's been another dry, eerily mild winter, like the year Laura was born. The reservoirs draw down. Vast wildfires are predicted for the summer. The daffodils come up 3 weeks early. Laura and I sit on the sidewalk, waiting for the bus to take her to Dixie School, where she receives special education services in a classroom setting. She's 4 years old now, old enough to ride the school bus on her own. I write a T in white chalk on the concrete. I say, Laura, can you trace T? Purpa, she says, and I hand her the purple chalk. She traces a ragged T, like a shadow cast by mine. I'm so happy, saying, yay, Laura, yes. She pumps her fist and says, S. She's speaking more clearly now. In the fall, she had tubes placed in her ears to correct a moderate hearing loss. Her tonsils and adenoids came out too. Soon afterwards, her articulation began to improve. We noticed it particularly in the vowels, long A, short A, O, and U. Debbie McFeeters, then Laura's speech-language pathologist, speculated that the reason she'd always done better with consonants, P, B, and M, was that she'd been lip reading. You can't see the difference between long and short A. But Laura still found speech difficult. Her solution was to use the same word for multiple meanings. Bop, for instance, could mean pizza, stop, or potty, and clarify the different meanings with her hands. And we had done sign, which I write about through the middle of the book. Saying bop while signing eat meant pizza. While doing a karate chop against the palm, stop. While patting her rear, the elusive but slowly improving potty. At some point it struck me that Laura was signing while she spoke, exactly the way our early intervention coordinator had shown us how to do years ago, when we hardly knew what Down syndrome was. I hear the familiar diesel engine, and the yellow bus trundles around the corner and pulls up in front of the house. I say hi to the driver, lift Laura into her seat, buckle her in, kiss her, and tell her to be good. As the bus pulls away, she is waving to me from the window. 4 mornings a week, Laura attends a second preschool, the Oregon State University Child Development Center, known also as Bates Hall. Laura is the only child with Down syndrome there. At Bates, Laura receives no services, but she's learning how to be with other children, and they are learning how to be with her. One morning I arrive early for pickup. I go inside, sit down in the observation room, and unfold my laptop. Over the glow of that day's searches, I will watch Laura through a wall of one-way glass. It's time for large group, and the class is singing The Wheels on the Bus, Laura's favorite song. Laura sits on her carpet square and rotates her fist one over the other, backup singer style, for round and round, claps her hands together for open and shut, swings a thumb up over her shoulder for move on back. She loves large group. At first she needed someone to sit behind her, but she knows the routine now. That Laura is part of the group, that she sits cooperatively on her carpet square, is an achievement. Sharnaz Badei, the dark-haired, brisk, affectionate head teacher, has made it her business to teach Laura how things work, to hold her, insofar as possible, to the same standards as other children, and to help the other children understand her. Sharnaz is one of the many adults without whom inclusion would be a meaningless word. To include a child like Laura is not necessarily difficult, but it does take commitment. After large group comes small group. Laura is not cooperating. She is staging her sit-down strike, refusing to go to the library area. Laura says, reaches for the sky, denying the handhold of her armpits. I start to get up to go inside and intervene, then I think better of it. Sharnaz comes over, talks gently to Laura, then firmly lugs her to small group. The library area is directly opposite my chair. Laura makes faces at herself in the mirror, gesturing in one of her hermetic stories. It looks as if she's talking to me. I fold up the laptop and unplug it and put it away, and then I sling its weight over my shoulder. I leave the ambery twilight of observation. The classroom is bright and loud. Sharnaz says, "Look, Laura, look who's here." And Laura barrels across the room towards me in the way Ellie used to when she went to Bates Hall. At 9, Ellie is far too old for public hugs. Laura, however, is still incapable of reserve. She throws her arms around me, the best part of the day. Then I take her to the potty and we go outside with a tire swing. I have acquired minor fame at the Bates Hall playground, where for those kids who sit on the swing with Laura, I do the full-on clown routine. I pretend to get knocked down by the swing, then do somersaults and come up covered with bark chips. I pretend to take naps until the children wake me up with their screaming. I pretend to misplace the children. "Lara, Olivia, Laura," I say, "where are you?" Their orbit decays. I search for them in my wallet and under the bark chips. When the screaming gets too loud, "We're right here," with Laura echoing, "Ear." I discover them and then ask them why they didn't say something earlier. It is the way I play with children when I am not depressed, but it is also a calculated game of inclusion. Since it is about momentum and silliness and screaming and not, say, numeracy, Laura's deficits become temporarily irrelevant. And besides, I'm happy to embarrass myself for her sake. If the kids associate Laura with fun, laughter, and incompetent clown dad, it's fine by me. It beats the hell out of weird-looking kid who can't talk. I say, "Okay guys, 5 more minutes. We have to get home in time for the bus." The kids protest. I give them a last push, and they scream with happiness. Laura is screaming too, saying, "Zoom, zoom." The other kids think Laura is saying zoom because they're going fast, so they say it too. Laura is saying zoom because zoom is how Laura says more. It was Teresa who figured out the etymology. In daily life, we don't say more. We say some more, as in, "Do you want some more oats and milk?" Laura chose, for whatever reason, to contract the phrase to some, which she pronounces zoom. We say, "Look at me." We say, "Laura, look at me." More. She says, "Zoom." She likes it. We know what it means. She owns zoom. In general, it is difficult to sway her once her mind is made up, though what looks like stubbornness may only be a difficulty in changing course. We say more, and it comes back zoom. We say TV, and it comes back bobo. The etymology was again complex and personal. Bobo was Laura's best pronunciation of Elmo, which stood in general for TV. Therefore, Bobo equals TV. Bobo could also refer specifically to Elmo in the way that bread can denote either bread or food in general. Give us this day our daily Bobo. We spent a lot of time clarifying which Bobo Laura meant, how much Bobo she could have, and whether she could have chips along with Bobo. Sometimes, to make her case that Bobo should be allowed right now and in unlimited quantities, Laura would drag out the old invented sign for TV, flicking her fingers beneath her chin. We said no, signing for emphasis, or we caved and agreed. We consented in every way to her terms. Since the beginning, she has been teaching us. She translates our messages, we retranslate the translation. We say zoom and bobo. We say oop instead of oops. Laura, for reasons of her own, deleted the trailing S. Others learned her language too. Lara, a tire swing regular, who had become something that once seemed as improbable as a unicorn, a friend, had begun saying da around the house. When her father asked what it meant, she told him, "That's how you say yes in Laura." Thank you all so much for coming.
I'm so glad you read my favorite part. It was to stay our daily Bobo. I'm so happy to be here, and I thank Marcia Childress for asking me to come today, and I especially want to thank George. It's people like you that share glimpses of their life with us that help us to increase our understanding, and I'm so appreciative. I'm also appreciative of this chance to really reflect on what it means in this context, to be a physician, and really for me to be a parent and just a member of this society. I was touched by the book on so many levels. Superficially, we share some geography with Charlottesville and Chapel Hill. It just so happens that we share a mutual friend, Eddie Frothingham, who is a med school classmate of mine that I still correspond with, a friend of George's and also Laura's, pediatrician. And it was him who introduced me to the book just a few weeks ago. I'm also a junk food junkie, closeted more and more as I become more of a parent and in the healthcare profession, but truly one. The other interesting coincidence is that this summer I was basically dragged kicking and screaming to a fishing lodge by my father for his 70th birthday, very remote in Ontario, in one of the many lakes that you have to take a float plane to get to, so not inhabited by very many people. And then I was dragged over by my father, who wanted me to meet all of his fishing buddies, and met Ross Ungerleider, who is Laura's cardiac surgeon. And neither of us said anything about the book. I hadn't read the book yet, and then as I'm preparing for this and going through the book, I almost fell over. So we do share some interesting coincidences. I'm also the aunt to an amazing 8-year-old niece, my sister's daughter, who at the age of 2 became very seriously ill. She had more than a dozen surgeries herself and spent 4 months in an ICU, and now is happily in 1st grade and speaks with the keyboard that she controls with her head and drives around in an electric wheelchair and eats via a G-tube. In medical speak, her outcome is severe morbidity, or a very bad outcome. But in reality for us, she fills a place in our family that could be filled by no one other. And if all that wouldn't have happened, and we often talk about this, we wouldn't know this, and her name is Ellie. Another coincidence. But I think most importantly as a physician, I think in my mind what this book teaches us is humility, that we cannot begin to know what it's like to be the parent of a child that we're caring for, or really who this person will become. And in fact, also highlighted in the book is how wrong medicine has been in the past, and it's only in very recent times, if you look at humans as a whole, that we haven't institutionalized children who were seen to be abnormal or less than normal. The things that we can do, I think, are really listen and really see the whole person, and George talks a lot in the book about child first, and I think we should move to child of course, and someone else's child at that. So even in our language, where we shouldn't probably be saying, oh, all my leukemics I do this for, or my children with Down syndrome. They're not our children. They are children in our practice that we care for that happen to have certain diagnoses. I also think that we can realize and really sort of internalize that everyone has something, everyone has a story, and probably something that's hard in their lives. It may be a medical diagnosis, it may be something else, but until we ask or until we really get to know someone, we may not yet know what it is. But I think we should be very careful not to make any assumptions. And I think the other important aspect of this, and one that struck me probably very profoundly and maybe the most deeply with our experience with my niece, was that it's not a us versus them. It's not a us who are normal, who are caring for people who are sick, who are not normal. It's that all of us are a phone call away, or a diagnosis away, or a lab test away, or a chromosome away from having the rug pulled out from under us. Having all kinds of people in this world is what's normal. And as physicians, we can be with the families as they figure out what this means for their lives. And we can try to balance the predictions and the prognoses and the tests and the treatments with the knowledge that there's a whole lot that we don't know. And that something abnormal does not necessarily equal unhappiness. It may not be an easy life, but it can still be a good life. And even as George says in the book, if there's an aftertaste of if in every when, we can be there to help people achieve their maximum potential and find a comfortable place in this world. In order to do this, as doctors and as healthcare professionals, though, we must first, ourselves, continue to have a dual perspective of seeing the child and the family, and then whatever it is that they face medically in their lives at the same time.
Thank you. And George, did you want to mention your website?
Oh yeah. John, can we get that slide up there? So, yeah. So this is my website. It's just my name .com. I don't know. If you have a tiny press that is in transition, as it's delicately put, you try and just tell people about this. So there's an excerpt there, and order it, and so on. Thanks, John. One of the best parts about doing these kind of presentations apart from having people say nice things about me, which is also very enjoyable, is a chance to have conversations. And I was lucky enough to visit Marcia's class yesterday, and you know, I'll say to you what I said to them is, most people are of really goodwill, but people are also really afraid of saying the wrong thing or speaking, you know, the wrong way. And we can just put that aside, just don't worry about it. I think it's important just to have whatever conversations we need to have, so let it rip. Yes?
Hi, I'm Margaret Woolman, and thank you both for an insightful and illuminating presentation. And George, this is a question for you, that
Sure.
While knowing the difficulties in speaking sort of secondhand, I'm interested in your take on how this has been for Ellie.
It's funny that that's a question I'm always asked, and I'm really glad to hear it. So, and the way I explained this yesterday is, how many of you are familiar with the children's author Beverly Cleary, the Beezus and Ramona books? Wonderful Portland author, wonderful writer. So Beezus is the long-suffering older sister, and Ramona is, there's one book called Ramona the Pest, who is a very free-spirited, wonderful child who divides about half of her time to making Beezus' life miserable. Beezus is called Beezus because it's how Ramona says Beatrice. That's the best description I've seen of Ellie and Laura. Ellie's a great older sister. She's very protective of Laura too. And Laura absolutely worships her, but she worships Ellie in the way that Prometheus worshipped the gods, which is to say worship and wanting to steal stuff. So they have a good, what I would call, normal relationship, which is to say there's, you know, they'll butt heads, but they get along pretty well. Yeah, whatever. I accidentally erased it, but the little picture on my phone is always like Ellie will grab it and say here, and then take a picture of the two of them. Yes.
Hi, I'm Chris Peterson, and I wanted to say thank you as well for two wonderful presentations. My youngest brother has Down syndrome.
Okay.
He was born in 1970,
Okay.
when I was 19 years old, and he was the eighth of all of us. I'm the oldest. And I have two little stories, if I could,
Sure.
to share with you that are stories that we've inherited that illustrate really the inconsistencies and incongruities that you have to unite, in order to make a life. So when Joel was born, one of my brothers was 8 years old, and he had gotten the word that the baby was a mongoloid, the term at the time in 1970. And he did what a kid does at age 8 and went to the Encyclopedia Britannica to look up mongoloid. And for those of you who are young, that's what you did before Google was a verb. So he goes to the Encyclopedia Britannica and looks up mongoloid and finds in the first paragraph a description of a deformed and mentally retarded individual and the word monster.
Oh, wow.
Monster was there in the definition of mongoloid in the Encyclopedia Britannica.
Yeah.
So from an 8-year-old boy's perspective, that was really pretty cool. You know, Mom was bringing home a monster, and he was pretty disappointed when she brought home a pretty normal baby.
That's a great story, and having read a lot of these descriptions, I mean, I didn't get into it today, but I kind of made it my project just to see how Down syndrome was described. Because I realized soon after beginning this that if you're telling the story of a kid with Down syndrome, that story is opposed to a reigning story. And I don't mean that it's opposed to the medical account. The medical account is necessary. But there's a parallel story that generalizes people with Down syndrome that makes them all alike. And I saw talking about one individual as being opposed to that. But I mean, there's some shocking stuff from much more recently than 1970, but Monster is over the top.
So the other half of the story is that, you know, needless to say, that all of us brought Joel up. He was a completely welcome member of the family. He did everything with us, went to vacation, went swimming at the Y, took dance lessons, was an altar boy, blah, blah, you know, just the whole 9 yards. So I was talking to him once when he was about 20.
Yeah.
And he was talking about having done something with his group of friends, maybe gone bowling or something. And I asked him, I said, Joel, tell me about your friends. He said, well, he said, some of them are like me, they're special. And some of them are like you, they're plain.
Thank you.
Talk about humility.
Well, this is also for George. I'm Rob, I'm a chaplain, and I'm also married to a special education teacher and administrator, and as a substitute myself, I always say yes to special ed. So I have some intense interest in this and now have clarity on what to get her for her birthday. My question is, as a chaplain, I was intrigued by what the diagnosing doctor said to you. I think what he wanted to say is, your family strikes me as being particularly well equipped to raise this child in a good way. But that isn't what he said. What he said was of breathtaking theological significance.
I know.
To refresh the listeners, I found that these kinds of children are only given to those families most likely to care for them. Could you comment on that?
I would, and I actually returned to that at the end of the book. So one of the kind of themes pervading this book is what it is for a writer to run up against failures of language, and what it is to run up against the wordless, which is and this was a case where I mean, this Kevin is a friend, and he's a wonderful doctor, and there were times where I didn't take offense. It didn't apply to me, but what I took from it was all of the wordless that informed it, his intent. I knew what he meant, that his intention was to reassure, to affirm our abilities as parents. We talked about this in Marcia's class a little bit yesterday. Interestingly, there's a new book by Amy Julia Becker called A Good and Perfect Gift. And it's also about raising a child with Down syndrome. And it's very explicitly through the lens of Christian faith. And she had someone tell her that, and she reacted very strongly against it, very angrily. Not being religious, I take your point about it being theologically significant to know any specific claim about God's intention for any earthly act. I assume that's but for us, my short answer is that we became those parents. That if this is a gift given, it's a gift that you have to earn and learn to be worthy of. And from a purely literal standpoint, I don't think that that's true. I think there are many disabled kids who come to families where they should not be. But I took the wordless intention behind the words. Yeah. Kind of like when you're an English teacher, all these people always say, "Oh, I'm going to watch my words around you." It's just like, I'm not going to proofread your email. It's okay.
I wonder if I could ask Ann to offer some comments in response to that question as well, since you're based in the newborn nursery, and while you may not be the physician providing the diagnostic news, you may be in a position to be talking to families about the news that they've received.
Well, I think, again, I think that probably the biggest mistake we could make would be to assume that we know what the meaning of this diagnosis would be for that family. I would probably try to stay away from theological explanations unless I already knew that that was an important part of a particular family's life. I think that it's more about the news and providing hope and answering questions to next steps and really getting a sense of, in that moment, what the family's going through. And then just continuing to have conversations. The end of the caring relationship is not the handing over of the diagnosis, but the more that I'm going to be there with you. If you have questions, we're going to try to find the answers, and we're going to try to do everything we can to help you.
Yeah, and if we didn't live in Oregon, we would move here and have Ann be our doctor. This is wonderful to hear, because it's what I have never delivered a diagnosis of Down syndrome. I imagine it must be extraordinarily difficult. It is in my field, because you can't deliver. Parents want certainty. You can't deliver it. You've got a kid with an AV canal defect. You can't say, it's all going to be fine. You know, they want certainty about the future. They want reassurance, and you have to be realistic about the risks and yet not go, overboard. I think it's a very difficult rhetorical situation. Speaking for myself, we really appreciated people who asked us, how are we doing, rather than telling us. Just said, who just asked, and we were very lucky. The majority, there are a couple of bad encounters with medical professionals that I narrate in here, but we on the whole, I thought we were very fortunate.
Hi, I'm Sherry Nelson, and I'm actually a nurse educator that just recently joined the Children's Hospital, and the mother of a son with Down syndrome who was born in 1984. He passed away 3 years ago, and that's a very long story that I won't get into, but I think the most powerful message that I got from our home pediatrician was to make it good for me was she said, Sherry, what you need to do is take him home and love him, just like you did your first child. And to me, that made it helped me navigate a lot, so thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And in a similar thing, I taught the first early intervention coordinator I talked to, it's sooner or later they come to the house, and I called her and said, so, we have a baby with Down syndrome, and she said, well, congratulations on your new baby. And then, and it was such a shock. It was just because it was complete, it was not like congratulations asterisk, it was just congratulations, and I just, it was a shock to me that it was a shock, but that really was a huge reset. Thank you for that story.